And welcome to Lift FM 98.5, 103.3, and of course 97.9 on your FM radio dial. Worldwide as well at liftfm.com. And of course, all of our programs of Second Chances are available. We have a nice archive of them available at our Advantage Radio Ministries website. That's www.advantageradioministries.org, advantageradioministries.org. Click on Second Chances, and then you can scroll through and see all the programs of all the previous guests and a lot of really terrific interviews and a lot of great things of what the Lord has done. And we are privileged to have with us Cease Murphey today. Cease has written a book entitled When a Man You Love Was Abused, and we're going to learn about the book. We're going to learn about Cease, and we'd like to thank you for joining us, Cease.
Thank you so much, Greg, for having me on your program.
We thank you. Of course, Cease is short for Cecil, correct?
That's correct.
All right. Now, Cease, so we get a little understanding of you. Give us a little bit of a background of, where you're from, were you raised in a Christian home or a non-believer's home, and just a little bit of a background of where you're from and who you are.
Okay, well, I was born in Iowa, but my folks moved. I was born in Oklahoma, but my folks moved to Iowa when I was about 5. Totally non-Christian home. I often say that probably I went maybe 50 times to church or Sunday school during my growing up years. I didn't like it very much. Last time I left, I was in the church. I was 11 years old. Was kind of bored, left it, and it was about 10 or 11 years before I returned.
Wow.
And the reason I returned is simply this. I fell in love with a woman that I thought I would marry and live with the rest of my life, and she dumped me. Not that I was the first person in the world to be dumped, but it just, God used that to make me ask the right kind of questions. Is this all there is in life, up and down and death at the end? And I thought there must be something more. It's quite a long story, but I started to read the Bible. And I started with the Gospel of Matthew. By the time I got to Romans 10:20, I read the verse, I was found of those who sought not for me. And when I read that, it just stopped. I realized that I believed that. I believed in God, and yet I hadn't been seeking to know God. I just wanted peace of mind. And then my question was, oh, okay, I believe. Now what? I guess I'd better start going to church. So that's what I did.
How old were you when this transformation in your life happened?
Oh, 21 or 22.
So once that transformation in your life happened, what changed in your life?
Oh, everything. I was in the Navy in those days, and with a pretty rough group of guys, and I was on shore duty, and I just realized that I couldn't be part of that group anymore. I felt like an outsider, and when I would try to talk to them about my faith, I got nowhere. So I started going to church, and there was a group on the naval base called the Fellowship of Protestants. And so I joined them, and they became my support group. And I'm still in touch with three of the people from that group today, because we were all kind of new in the faith, and we nurtured each other.
So during those early years, did you know what the Lord was going to do in your life as a Christian? Did you feel Him starting to steer a certain direction, or did that come later?
Well, it's kind of a funny thing, Greg. About the time I became a serious believer, do you know how to say it? I had this sense that God wanted me to serve Him. Now, when I was a child in Sunday school, I had this Sunday school teacher, maybe 6, 8 times I went to her class, and one reason I stopped going because every time I'd walk in, she'd lay her hands on me and start speaking in tongues and telling me that God had called me God had His hand on me. God had a use for me. God was going to use me. And I didn't like hearing that. So, that's why I stopped going. That was one of the reasons I stopped going. But when I became a believer, I realized that, God did have His hand on me. And by the way, later on, I went to see the woman and thanked her. But, and it was really wonderful. But the only thing I had a sense of is that I was to prepare for the ministry. So I did.
And by the way, was that a Pentecostal Assembly of God church you went to?
The church I went to originally was just an independent Pentecostal church. But the first church I joined was a Baptist church, the General Conference Baptist.
Mm-hmm.
And floated around to several different denominations, but I've been a Presbyterian for 30 years.
Mm-hmm. Now, tell us about the work that the Lord wanted you to do, Cease.
Well, while I was preparing and going to school, getting my undergraduate degree, I was also able to teach. In those days, you could teach if you were working on a degree in education. So after a couple of years, I think 3 years of college, I taught for a year or two. But once I got my degree, my wife and I felt God wanted us to go to Kenya, East Africa. So we went and we served there for 6 years. Mm. I loved those years. They were the hardest years. They were the best years. And yet I felt I needed to know more. So I decided we decided to come back to the United States for two reasons. One is that I felt I needed more education. But second, my wife and my children had so much trouble with malaria. I never was affected by it, but they all came down with malaria regularly. And they just couldn't live in that climate anymore. So I came back and got a master's degree in theology and one in education. I was a pastor for 14 years.
Mm. So how did you go from being a missionary to a pastor to writing or co-authoring more than 100 books, including the best-selling book Gifted Hands, which has sold more than 3 million copies?
I'm sorry?
I said and that one has sold more than 3 million copies. So how did you go from that to that?
Well, I came when I was in seminary. I got a call one day. The dean of students was looking for somebody to fill in on a Sunday. They couldn't get anybody, and I did. And I preached at a very small church, and I liked the people. They liked me, and the next thing I knew, I was their pastor and stayed the pastor until I finished seminary. And I did some graduate school work, and I was their pastor there. And then I went full time as a pastor and went on from there. But Greg, about a year after seminary, and I was still doing some graduate school work, I just felt I wanted to write. I'd always wanted to write, didn't know much about it. And there was a wonderful Christian man named Charlie Shedd, who's dead now, but Charlie wrote a book called Letters to Karen, Letters to Philip, and it was very popular back then. I graduated in 1970, and Charlie came to Atlanta, where I was studying, and offered a course in writing for publication. I took it. It came on Monday evenings. I took it. He said to me, "You can write, start a group, teach yourselves to write." So I did, and within 4 months, I sold my first article, then my second, my third, and so on. And that led to books. And then finally, in 1984, I faced an identity crisis. I had to ask God, am I a preacher who writes or a writer who preaches?
And what did he tell you?
It was a terrible decision, Greg, because you know what? I like them both. And I also taught 1 day a week, one course at a time, at a local Bible college. So, I was having a great time. The church was growing. But the more I prayed about it, the more I realized that I was first a writer. So I resigned the pastorate and have been writing full-time ever since.
I see among the books you've written an autobiography of Franklin Graham. How did that come to be? Just a little quickie on that, just out of curiosity.
I'm sorry, I didn't get your question.
I'm sorry. Among the books you've written, an autobiography on Franklin Graham.
That's correct.
How did that come to be?
Uh, I wrote Gifted Hands. His assistant, Donna Ray, read it, liked it, told him that he ought to get me. What I didn't know is that an editor, Thomas Nelson, also called Franklin and said, Cease Murphey is the guy who ought to write your book. So,
Guess you were meant to do it, huh?
yeah, and it was a good experience. I learned a lot. He learned some things. I always feel that when I write somebody's story, I need to learn some things too. It's not just getting their story out, but it's also learning who they are and appreciating them.
Mm-hmm. Now, Cease, I have a cheat sheet in front of me about your book, When a Man You Love Was Abused, but there's a quote. There's a quote here at the top, and I just want to kind of find out about this quote because I really like it. We don't forget, not really. We can erase the worst traumas by an act of the will. Where'd that quote come from?
From me.
And what does that quote speak to in particular?
Okay, well, let me give you my story here, Greg.
Okay,
I was
please.
sexually assaulted as a child, first by a female relative. It started with, when you're small, fondling and that sort of thing. And after she even stopped doing that, until I was probably 14, 15 years old, not every time, but frequently, she'd hug me and throw her whole body into mine, and she'd tell me explicitly dirty jokes and, those kinds of things. So that was one side. The other side was when I was about 5 or 6, our family rented a room to a man on Social Security, pedophile obviously, and he abused my older sister and me.
Mm.
And see, here's the thing that happened to me. We have all kinds of ways of coping with trauma. The way I did it, it's not a way you choose. That's the way it happens. And for me, I had no memories of my childhood. I mean, absolutely none until I was 51 years old. And that's really how I cope with those. I absolutely did not remember. Now, Greg, I'm a runner, and I run every morning. And one day I was out running. I took a long run, like 12, 13 miles. And on the way home, I began to cry. Now, my dad was an alcoholic. He used to beat me quite a bit. When I was 10, 11 years old, I determined I would never cry again, no matter how much he beat me. And I had not really cried since I was 10 or 11 years old until that day. And it wasn't just crying. It was sobbing, uncontrollable sobbing. And as that happened, memories of childhood started leaking into my brain. And those painful memories began to come back. And see, what I realized is that even though I had unconsciously chosen not to remember them, you don't forget them. They're there.
So it's almost like you had a veil over your mind for that part of your life, and then at some point it just became exposed to you. Is that kind of what happened?
Yeah, and by the way, that's a nice way of saying it. Sure. What we can't handle, we deny. And one way to deny it is to forget it. And so if somebody had asked me when I was 30 years old, have you ever sexually assaulted? I would have said, well, of course not, I had absolutely no memory. But the thing that helped me, too, was after I began getting in touch with my memories, I called my sister, the one who'd been abused, and told her some things, and she said, you know what, I'd forgotten that, or so she said, I don't know. And that was part of it. Plus, there's some other things that I was able to validate. But the female relatives, I told another sister about her, and my sister said, well, you know what, I didn't know that, but I'm not surprised. And she said she was also sexually molested by her father, and said I suspected she did some of that, but I didn't know you were one of them.
Cease, you think of sexual abuse and you think a lot of, male to male type thing. unusual to, at least in my experience, to hear of a woman abusing a young boy. That you don't hear of that every day, do you?
Well, I'm hearing it more and more, and one of the reasons, Greg, is it's harder. It's hard enough for a man to talk about being abused anyway. I mean, we're supposed to be the tough guys, the guys who can push away all the sort of thing. We're strong, and so that's it. That in itself is hard enough to acknowledge. But when it's a woman who abuses us, there's even more shame attached to it. And I think there are a lot more women abusing boys than we're giving them credit for. I have a blog, and people are beginning to write in and talk about their abuse, some by the hands of a woman. And in my book, I tell several experiences of men who were abused by a mother, by a female relative, or women.
Mm. Now, obviously, some people, if they had that memory, they would, choose to, if it just came to them later in life, they might not be willing to share it, but not only have you shared it, but you've obviously written a book about it. Why did you decide to do the book now?
Well, actually, I tried to do the book around the year 2000. I wrote a couple of articles. I didn't know if it was right to do it. So I wrote articles for two different magazines. They published it. I got, half a dozen letters from both magazines. So that told me that this was the topic. It was time to get it out there. So I wrote the book. And Greg, it took me 6 years to find a publisher.
Wow.
And here's how I finally got it. 2 years ago, I was at a trade show, Christian book trade show, and an editor came to me, whom I've known for a long time, and he's every once in a while he'd say to me, we want to do a book with you one of these days. And I'd kind of laugh and move on. And so he said it again, and I said to him, yeah, I've got a book, but you won't do it. And he said, how do you know I won't do it? And I said, because you won't. No one else will. Why will you? So he said, well, what's it about? And I looked at him and I said, male sexual abuse. And he swallowed and looked at me, and finally he said, maybe we will. Mm. It still took them a year to decide to do it, but they did it.
Amen. Now, obviously, we're dealing with abuse and things like that. In your opinion, is there differences in how men or women deal with the emotional issues from abuse?
Well, I think there are a lot of commonalities. Never having been a woman, I can't give you all those answers. A lot of women tell me that when the abuse happened, that it hurt, it was painful, they cried out, they hated it. But a few of them have said to me, when you stimulate certain parts of the body, it feels good. Well, that's the problem with boys. And definitely we feel good. You stimulate parts of the body. It's a natural phenomenon. And see, that's part of our shame, because if it was bad, we should feel bad. But they did a bad thing to us, but it felt good. So you see, as a child of 6 or 7, you can't process that.
Mm. Now, you say right up in the front of your book to women reading the book that you can't do anything to make him into a whole person. Tell us about the process toward wholeness.
Well, and thank you for that question, Greg. The day I began to get my memories back, I did two things. I called my best friend, and I called my wife at work. Well, my wife was, because of the situation, she couldn't get away, but my best friend came over, held me and just hugged me and let me cry. And that's about all. I would try to talk, and I couldn't. I was crying so hard. And then when my wife got home around 5 o'clock, by then I'd calmed down, and we sat down and talked, and she took my hand and she said to me, I don't understand this. I don't know anything about abuse, but I love you, and I'm here for you, whatever happens. And see, Greg, that's what I needed to hear. I wasn't aware of it until she said it, but as soon as she said the words, I said to her, that's exactly what I need. How can you understand? She came from a Christian home. I call her a cradle Christian. She doesn't know what it's like not to know the Lord. And I come from this other side of the spectrum. But all I asked was for her to be there and let me talk. As memories start coming to me, she she never refused to listen. And that's what she did for me more than anything else. She listened and was just there.
Mm. You know, one of the things you hear way too much about, and, any type of abuses you don't want to hear about, but we hear so much about priests who abuse boys. And in particular, in this geographic area, it's really been a lot lately in the Philadelphia area. But it seems to be a much bigger issue than just the priest and the boys. Is it a bigger issue than that? And what do, in your opinion, the statistics say?
Listen, I have a blog called menshatteringthesilence.blogspot.com. menshatteringthesilence.blogspot.com. And men are now writing to me, and some women, and, scoutmasters, Sunday school teachers, priests are getting a lot of attention because of their trusted position. But what I've discovered is abusers come from every walk of life. Every walk of life.
Explain to me the difference between conditional and unconditional love for a man who was abused.
Well, I was one of those kind of kids that I felt I was loved and appreciated because of what I did. I see, every family has designations, and my dad was an alcoholic, my brothers were an alcoholic, but I was the good kid. I really was. Not perfect and sinful, but I was still a good kid in the family. And so because I was the good kid and I was nice to people and did the things that people expected, I felt that I was loved and appreciated because of what I did. And I think one of the things that opened me up, and probably the fact that I opened up more than anything else, was my wife and my best friend David. I honestly felt that they loved me without condition. One time I said to my wife, you'd love me even if I beat you. And Shirley said, but you would never beat me. And I said, of course I wouldn't, but, even if I did. And she said, no, I'm not going to play that game with you, she said, because you would never do it. Well, what she was saying to me is that, and what I was saying to her is that she never said, I will love you if. My best friend David, who's been my best friend now for 30 years, and that's the attitude he had. He refers to me as, he said, you show me your irrefutable love. And he does the same for me. And I know I don't have to do anything to make him like me, nor does he have to do anything to make me like him. That's what unconditional love is. You don't have to do anything to earn it or improve on it.
Last thing I want to ask before we pray for people that may have been in the situation that you've come from, and also talk about how to get the book. There's a term you use called conspiracy of silence. What do you mean by that term?
Thank you, Greg. Thanks for picking up on that. And this is true in most families. The conspiracy of silence is that families don't like talking about it. They're embarrassed about it. I think one of the big breakthroughs for every man I know, and for women too, is to bring it out into the open. When I finally brought mine out into the open, of my three sisters, two of them absolutely were wonderful with it. The third one was really unhappy, although after she read the book, she's come around to it. I had a sister-in-law who has since died. She hated the book. She said, you have no right to tell those stories. And I said, well, you have the attitude of these other kinds of people. You want the conspiracy because we keep silent about it. It's like it didn't happen. See, here's what we need to learn to do, those of us who have been abused, is if we need to bring it out to the open. As long as we keep it hidden, it's as if it doesn't exist. That's why it's a silent conspiracy.
Now, the most important thing that we do on this program, Cease, is we pray for people that may have been through things that our guests have been through to be set free. And we're going to do that in a moment. But before we do that, if this book and what you're talking about is really speaking to them, how does one obtain a copy of this book?
Well, any bookstore should have it, any Christian bookstore, Amazon.com, Christianbooks.com, By the way, I will tell you this: the publishers didn't think it would sell. It last month it went into its second printing, so
Amen.
proven that there is an audience out there.
Mm.
So any bookstore ought to be able to get it for them. When a Man You Love Was Abused.
Is it available on any kind of websites or your website or anything like that?
You can read about it on my website. I don't sell books on my website. I really like to encourage people to go to bookstores or at least Amazon or ChristianBooks.com.
Okay. Is there a website, though, they can learn more about you?
Sure, just Google my name, CecilMurphey.com.
Okay. And it'll bring up a website?
That's right.
Okay. Now, Cecil, if someone has been in that spot where they've been abused and they just can't seem to get grips with it, but they know that God can set them free, but they just haven't been able to do it, would you be willing to pray for those people that are listening right now that are at that point?
Absolutely. And, if they want to email me, I respond to everybody who emails me.
Okay. And that's Cecil Murphey, Murphey.
Yeah, even if you misspell it, you'll still get to me.
Okay. Would you lead us in that prayer, Cecil?
Sure. Oh, God, you are so loving, so caring, and there's so many people out there who are hurting, and some of them don't understand why this happened to them, and some of them blame you. But, Lord, I pray for peace, for healing, for understanding. I pray that you will bring people into their lives who will listen to them and care for them and enable them to open up and face the pain of their past. But most of all, oh God, by your Holy Spirit, I ask you to be the healing instrument in their lives. For I pray this through Jesus Christ. Amen.
Our guest tonight on Second Chances has been Cecil Murphey, discussing his book, When a Man You Love Was Abused. And Cecil, have you had a chance, by the way, to speak to any groups or anything about?
Oh, yes. There are a lot of Celebrate Recovery groups around the country. I've just connected with Exodus International. I'll be at their conference in North Carolina this summer. There's a group here in Atlanta that's really beginning to move at dealing with a whole issue of abuse called Voice Today. Yes, I'm really open to any of these groups. I want to get this word out there, and because I make a living as a writer, they don't have to worry about money to bring me in or out.
Mm-hmm. Well, Cecil, obviously the Lord has been using you as an instrument to help folks that have been struggling with this, maybe don't even realize they went through it, were suppressed. But the Lord has certainly used you as a wonderful tool to help them, and I'm sure the book will help them a lot. Any other books you've got coming up you're working on or will be bringing out soon?
I did the book 90 Minutes in Heaven with Don Piper, which has remained on the New York Times bestseller list since the fall of 2006. And we have a new one out called Getting to Heaven, Guiding... let's see... The subtitle is Departing Instructions for Your Life Now. Departing Instructions for Your Life Now. And the book is already doing quite well, but 90 Minutes in Heaven, that book is still going all over the world. It's in 40 languages. So, and I have a book coming out in November called Making Sense When Life Doesn't.
All right, Cecil, well, we want to thank you for being a guest on Second Chances one more time. The blog that they can get to you at on the blog?
Sure. They can go direct to my website and they can find it that way, or they can go to www.menshatteringthesilence.blogspot.com.
And Cecil, we'd like to thank you for being a guest tonight here on Second Chances at Lift FM and Advantage Radio Ministries.
Greg, thank you so much for having me, and God bless you and your ministry.
And may the Lord bless you too, Cecil. Thank you.
Bye-bye.